There's something that happens when you lose your religion, when you leave your church or your denomination. Not only do you lose community, but you also lose a piece of yourself. And with that comes all of the grief and the loss. Episode 9 on Farewell Evangelicalism. Welcome, friends. This is episode 9. My name is Rohadi, and I'm coming at you from Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. This is a serial season called Farewell Evangelicalism, designed to give the receipts to those who are in, adjacent, thinking about leaving, or who have left evangelicalism, the largest voting bloc in America and the largest voting bloc responsible for the calamity that we are in today. In this episode, we start to shift gears away from naming those malformed pillars in the past, and so far we've named conspiracy theory in episode 2 as conspiracy theory and conservative ideology working together to keep congregations in check. Episode 3, the pillar of propaganda, the tools that are used to keep folks believing in certain things and in certain ways. Episode 4 was on the patriarchy and how we named how propaganda is used to prop up the system of patriarchy. We then moved into biblical interpretation, white supremacy, and decolonization and deconstruction. This episode shifts gears to handle the grief and loss that happens when you leave your church tradition. Leaving makes a lot of sense, not only when you consider the malformed elements and pillars, but when you look at the results, the culture, the realities, the weird that your body absorbs. A recent study from the University of Louisiana has demonstrated that when evangelicals move into the neighborhood in large numbers, homicides actually increase. My hunch is that violence is attributed to the type of theology evangelicals adopt. A violent, rage-filled, wrathful God is created because it matches a violent, rage-filled man behind the theology. Similar studies from sociologists have also demonstrated that when evangelicals move into the neighborhood, civic engagement goes down. That's no surprise, given how we've described rugged individualism is one of the key components to evangelical belief and culture. It means I take care of myself and everyone else doesn't matter. The same can't be said for mainline traditions. When mainline church traditions, Protestants or Catholics move into the neighborhood, civic engagement increases and also homicides decrease. There is a correlation here. The malformed systems, beliefs, and theologies are in the DNA of these church traditions. Therefore, leaving makes a lot of sense. Where else are you going to find your total liberation? In this episode, we start to broach the aspects of grief and loss because as you process out of all the weird and the harm that your body has incurred, you're bound to experience unexpected grief. My first guest is Mandy, Capehart, who is a grief coach. She comes to offer different aspects, tools, and some thoughts of where we can go to hold grief well, because grief is always unexpected when it lands. I invite you into this episode where we prep for the grief and loss, and you decide enough is enough, and it's time to leave old church traditions.
My name is Mandy Capehart. I am a somatic practitioner and grief educator and certified trauma professional living in Southern Oregon, Grand Ronde family historical land. I said that so oddly. So I'm a coach online for grievers and grief supporters. I'm an author, podcaster, and I create as much space as I can to help people learn what it looks like to support ourselves intentionally and holistically through our grieving process, which is unending when we really dig into it. And awaken to the possibility of healing as our reality. So I'm available on all the social media platforms that aren't terrible. And my website is mandykpart.com.
Would you say that there is a common theme for folks who have entered their adult years and are now noticing that what they experienced in their formative years and even in their adult years was not right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, right? So, my background, I'm a Gen X millennial cusper, and I was raised in the Lutheran church. But from a young age, I grew up going to Catholic church with our neighbors as well. And all through college, I was part of Campus Crusade for Christ and evangelical Pentecostal churches as well. So, I have a very wide,
That's the
um,
whole thing,
I covered so many
practically.
of my bases, right?
Yeah.
And then
It's
I
everywhere.
married a Southern
Yeah.
Baptist family.
Oh,
So,
okay.
um,
Wah, wah. That's where I put the sad trombone.
I mean, hashtag they're amazing. But point is, I have spent a lot of my own experience within religion asking questions and pressing buttons and pushing back and frequently changing my path because I had so many questions that no one knew what to do with me. And so when I think about someone who is kind of in a similar situation, right? This demographic of people who have, whether they've been raised in a very strict tradition or they've been raised very open ended, there isn't a lot of safety, security, and belonging that exists. And that is what we're looking for as humans. And so when we are
Mm.
starting out with a baseline that's a little bit disrupted, so, for example, me going into somewhat diametrically opposed traditions, right? Lutheran Church and Catholicism, and having questions that don't create a safe ground for people. I don't have belonging with those people in one iota or another, right? It's that spectrum of belonging that I'm noticing, wow, I'm moving further away from these people when I ask these questions. Not that that stopped me, but it wasn't until I was older to recognize, oh, I created a sense of belonging here because that was what made sense. That was what seemed safe. That felt like security. And I didn't really understand what belonging meant to me. I understood what
Mm.
soothed my already disrupted and dysregulated nervous system. And that felt like, for me, performing as a worship leader for 16 years. I had a lot of relationships because I was a leader with Campus Crusade at my college. And a lot of our relationships, even now, 20 years after that, are all intact from that group, but none of us are still really actively involved in any of those church practices anymore. So it's really interesting to see how people who have grown up are asking questions now and learning how to become comfortable with their questions and learning how to come comfortable with no answers to their questions. I think that's really the scariest part is we deeply want certainty and we deeply want belonging, but those
Mm.
two aren't necessarily important for one another to exist, right? Belonging, safety, security, all of those things matter so deeply to us, but they come from such a different place than we expect. Certainly from a place that doesn't have to involve a religious practice. And I think that that's the most interesting part, maybe the most difficult part for people who are like, oh, I have to leave this practice, is recognizing there is safety, security, and belonging outside of a religious practice as well.
When we are in a space where we're seeking to like soothe our bodies, it is responding to some type of input, right?
Mhm.
And in a religious context, that to me strikes me as an alert. What
Yeah.
do we do with that?
Yeah. So as a somatic practitioner, I am a very have a holistic approach to work with people, but I'm always going to go back to how does that feel in your body? Which is important because
Mm-hmm.
especially in religious contexts, we don't know. We are not supposed to
Mm-hmm.
know what things
Mm-hmm.
feel like in our
Mm-hmm.
body.
Don't trust
So
that. Yeah.
don't trust that.
Don't
Don't
dig
listen.
there. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of where I go is first helping someone recognize what dis-ease or discomfort feels like in the body, that acknowledgement of tension, of discomfort, of even like headaches and bloating and nausea, confusion, all those things are connected to our nervous system and the way that it's responding to the information it takes in, right? So our nervous system is constantly scanning for threats. It says, that's a threat. I've got to trigger nausea so that you stay away, because if you go closer, you get more nauseous about it. Then the answer becomes, how do we soothe the nausea? Well, if we're not aware of the way our nervous system is responding and correlating the two, right? If we don't say, well, I see this person who I get really nauseated every time I'm around them and I'm not sure why, that level of awareness gives us a sign that we can say, well, step one, soothing might mean not going around them. That can be really complicated, because what if that's our pastor? What if that's our parent? What if that's this person we've led a youth group with for 20 years, right? We beginning to become more aware of ourselves are also putting ourselves in a situation where we have some choices to make. And I can't recommend highly enough that we incorporate soothing practices before we start making any decisions. Because when we make a decision out of a dysregulated state, where we're nauseated, where we're upset, then we're in that state of our nervous system that is fight or flight and all the other F's that they've come up with that go along with that. And that really shuts off our decision-making process simply to the baseline of survival. We're not looking for survival anymore because we've been surviving and we've lived in a way that felt like belonging, safety, and security. We are now asking these questions and honoring what we sense in our bodies because we want to live differently. So creating a sense of soothing at a baseline level for ourselves means that when I then next time encounter this person and feel nauseated, my brain's going to say, ooh, we know how to deal with this threat. Remove yourself and go hug something that feels great. Go find music that brings you back down to a baseline, right? We've got strategies. And then when we're in that more relaxed, open, parasympathetic state, we can go back and say, now what? Now I don't feel so dysregulated when I see that person. Now I can ask some different questions and even go so far as to like say, hey, actually, I'm quitting, or you're not my person anymore, or whatever that path leads to.
Developing that attunement to your body and traditions, let's just say faith in general, which definitely pushes against trusting or listening or giving language to the sensations of your body, what it's trying to alert you to, definitely holds a lot of us back from extricating ourselves from communities ultimately that are not life-giving. And the more we're in tune with ourselves, maybe the sooner we get out. But here's the thing, you might be questioning, you might be finally becoming more alert to what your body is doing when it's in certain communities or situations in those communities, let's just say churches, and the body's saying you no longer fit. And maybe you have rationally, intellectually worked it out, I no longer fit. And that leads folks who are coming out of religious minefields, religious communities, leaves them at a crossroads.
Yeah.
And it's scary because in the pit of your stomach, remember now that's that body again, you're wondering, this is so unknown, I'm afraid. And you start to weigh the pros and cons, which is ultimately a question of like the losses if you were to leave, but what could be gained on the other side.
Yeah.
Do you have tools that you invite folks into who are at that crossroads or have begun the journey down a different path, yet are holding now either the baggage or the loss of what was before?
Yeah, I think we have to start with developing deep wells of self-compassion. We would never look at a child who's learning something new and say, ooh, this is a hard thing to learn. You're a terrible person for not figuring it out right away. Because we're trying to reorganize our entire lives. For me, I was so involved in our church, so connected to so many people. It's only recently, and I left years ago, recently that I realized I wasn't actually in friendships with people. I was offering myself as a friend and serving the community through volunteering in many ways, I don't really remember receiving friendship in a way that felt like reciprocity, in a way that
Mm-hmm.
felt like attunement, in a way that I felt seen and pursued, right? We
Mm-hmm.
hear that, oh, well, no one ever calls me. I call other people all the time. That's reciprocity. That's attunement, right? That's seeing, oh, this person needs to be spent time with them. Uh, I should call them, or I want to spend time with them. Why don't I call them? So, really, the first thing I invite people into is recognizing you're reorganizing your entire life.
Yeah.
And you are reassessing, well, who am I now if I'm not defined by the people I know, the places I go, the things that I do? What am I defined by? Where does my value come from? I think a lot of people too, and you've heard this argument, well, your identity comes from the Lord. So press into that. When we are questioning that because of how scriptures and how churches have used that as
Mm-hmm.
a tool to organize us or create a hierarchy or even put us into positions based on what the Lord has called us into through their opinion, through our understanding, whatever that is, we are now assessing our identity, our belonging, our security, our safety, our connection. So many things begin to unravel, which is why if you cannot begin with a source of self-compassion, the critical voice, the shoulds, the condemnation, that all gets too loud. And that what I have seen is people start to spiral and just think, okay, well, all of religion is toxic because this isn't good for me. That's not true. A lot of religious practices are really healing and restorative for people. But if you do not know where you are right now, it will be very difficult to chart a path forward because you don't know the direction you're aiming in, right? If your goal is to try and get back into a religious community that feels safe, that's something you need to know about yourself that you want so you can then define what does safety look like in that community, right? For me, I spent years not attending anything because of COVID as the start. And then it was the absence that helped me realize, oh, we've been kind of forgotten. Oh, we're being criticized. Oh, okay. Interesting. We pulled out purely because my husband has an immune disorder and there was like safety and all the unknowns,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's taken a very long time for me to realize there is still a community within Christendom that I can participate in that feels like safety, but it's nothing like what it was before for me. And even still, I'm very tentative, and it
Sure.
is a deep friendship that includes reciprocity and attunement that even drew me back toward it.
Hmm. I would hazard a guess that folks who are on that crossroads, they know the old thing is not the life-giving thing in pieces,
Mm-hmm.
yet they don't have a sense of where they're going next. They haven't figured out like, oh, it's a religious thing I want next. Oh, it's not a religious thing I want.
Right.
I don't even know what I want is probably what it's at. I just know that the old thing is not it. I know
Didn't
the
work.
old thing is beat.
Yep.
And I cannot live out my whole self in that safety and belonging in the old way. And so I go down one of these pathways at the crossroads, has before me, yet I know, and this is also something where church folks, Christians who leave, there's going to be a cost,
Yeah.
but you didn't really believe or want to believe the magnitude of that cost, usually in community.
Yeah.
And how many people are going to abandon you. As these new pieces, when we choose a more life-giving way, and there are many pathways for that, but the more life-giving way to escape that which pressed us down, we start to hold the loss and the grief.
Yeah. I take people into mindfulness practices because my experience within evangelical Christianity was I don't want to say mindless, but it was not around being mindful in the moment. It's a very future oriented environment, right? The Lord is coming. The end is near. I'm prophesying life and abundance into you. I'm calling checks in the mail into me. It's all about what's coming, what's coming. You just got a really quick insight into a lot of my background in those few sentences there.
Yeah. I was like, me too. Wait, what?
Yeah.
I almost fell for it.
Oh, man. And so for me, and I tend to be a future oriented person anyway, but learning how to hold space for your own discomfort is so necessary. Inside of Christianity, we often minimize or spiritually bypass the discomfort by saying, oh, the Lord is faithful, the Lord is good, all those things. And when we are used to spiritual bypassing as a normal practice, and we call it encouragement, or we call it the prayer tree, then we do not have an awareness of how our nervous system is actually reacting to what is happening in the here and now. And so whether it's a mindfulness of breath or a mindfulness of our thoughts, a mindfulness of our body, a mindfulness of our emotions, holding space and not trying to fix, explain, or remove any of those experiences, but honoring that they're here, noticing what they have to offer, noticing the sensation and the quality of them, or really just practicing 30 seconds of noticing what my body feels like, noticing what my emotions are right now, naming them and honoring that as enough. Because that's where so many of us, again, from religious communities are trained to go is, and now we've studied the Bible and now we simply must apply it and create churches to plant and lead Bible studies and convert the souls, instead of just saying like, oh, I sat by the water for 20 minutes and I put my feet in the water and it was enough. And I saw the face of God and I lowered my blood pressure and I stopped trying to script a fight I have to have later with my kid's teacher. And I'm suddenly not as bitter about my best friend's betrayal as I thought I was. The things that fall off of us when we are mindful of what's happening within us, that is the deep work of removing trauma, right? That's the beginning of it, because trauma doesn't sit in that cognitive front part of our brain where we can just say, oh, you were abused as a child. Don't worry. The Lord is faithful to those who've been abandoned. He millstones around the feet of child abusers. You're going to be okay. It's not a cognitive process. It's an embodied, deep-rooted process that we have to move through. And the more we honor our body is safe, our body is good, our body belongs, the more we are able to take all of these integrative pieces of our whole selves and bring them back into alignment. So your tool for me is mindfulness on all fronts. And I know that sounds really difficult because it freaking is. It is hard, but it's worth it.
The theme of your pathways, your tools, the things that you invite friends and clients into, and of course, somatic healing, but they're deeply embodied, which is so ironic because Christianity is supposed to be a deeply embodied faith.
Yeah.
Yet that is such the opposite of so many of our experiences. I would venture to guess that most contemporary churches in the West are disembodied, intentionally disembodied, because
intentionally, yes,
ways that they are connected to all of the intersections of power.
Yep. You can't empower someone to embody their experience when you are using the body of Christ as the bargaining chip for the foundation of your faith. This is where I've gone to with it. So this could just be me. But when I consider all the disembodiment that is required to be a part of evangelical Christianity in my experience, and not even in my like localized experience, in my globalized experience of, oh, I read this book, I heard this sermon, I met this person, and maybe the pastor I was sitting under for those times didn't embody that teaching, but also wasn't speaking actively against it. I think about the way that scripture has been removed from its original intent, in my opinion, as positioning Christ against empire. And when I think about being able to disempower empire, I cannot show up disembodied from myself. But if I want to maintain empire, which is reliant on my labor, which is reliant on my weakness, which is reliant on me needing something to feel secure, safe, and belong, a sense of belonging from empire itself, I have to be disembodied, because when I am embodied, I tap into every level of wisdom within me that has been there for generations. Like the fact that my nervous system knows that something is inherently unsafe when I've never encountered it in my life, that's not from me. That's from generational design. And I think the second we start to embody ourselves, and I think this is a lot of why people are like, oh my gosh, my sexuality is not what I always thought it was too, now that I'm free of the church. It's not a, I wanted to sin, so I left. It's a, oh my gosh, I have awareness of what's living within me and has been there all along.
Ooh, that's it. That's the thing. Dang. Didn't deconstruct just to sin. Okay, last question. For the folks who have been on this journey, they're further along. Grief, loss keeps coming back. Maybe through a Western lens, we are looking for answers and solutions. We are looking to be healed rather than adopting a posture of our bodies always in a rhythm of healing.
Mm-hmm.
We want a destination to say, I made it, my traumas, I beat them. Is it not true that as we meander through this thing called life, that we will encounter out of nowhere fragments, moments of grief and loss and traumas? What do we do when, I guess we could go back to the suggestions and just remember the work of attunement and strategies of embodiment. Does it look any different when we are down that pathway, but now are a little bit more mature in our embodiment exercises, yet perhaps surprised of, wait a minute, I thought I dealt with this. You know what I mean?
Wonderful question.
Mm.
I think the reason we are shocked when grief comes back around down the road is because we're still addicted to certainty in some degree. We want a period at the end of the sentence. We want the idea that salvation is locked in. Don't worry. It's not going anywhere, because we never remembered that we could believe we were never separated in the first place. And salvation was not intended to be this pit of fiery hell that we avoid, but instead to be called back into relationship, right relationship with each other and the earth, right? So,
Did you just say, hang on, did you just say that we were not separated to begin with?
yeah,
That's just like, we gotta, stop.
yeah, that's my thought. We'll talk more for sure on that. But I want to answer that. Yeah, the grief question about, yes, of course, you can come back to mindfulness practice and somatic work and all of those things later in life. The idea being, when we start approaching ourselves with that open curiosity, when we say, what could be possible for me if I were to attempt some kind of healing work? Start asking questions about what hurts so much. We are meeting the need that we missed out on in the first place that caused the harm. So trauma comes from a need that goes unmet. And if it goes unmet for a long period of time, of course, it takes a longer period of time to show up and retrain the brain to say it's safe to meet that need. That need is met. You are okay. But what we find is that with grievers who are like, well, I dealt with this and then I never went back to it, they're bypassing in a lot of ways. They're allowing themselves to believe the lie that something is one and done. I am still impacted by people I met when I was a child. I had a friend in third grade who was killed on his way home from soccer practice riding his bike. I had hung out with him the day before. He was such a love. His name was Tim. And I am now 40 years old, but when I was 8, a friend of mine was killed, and I am still deeply affected by that. It does not mean that I will eventually stop grieving him. It means that as a parent, I remember that experience. And when my daughter gets on a bike, I have work to do in myself, lest I go and scare her from riding a bike, right? There are so many details about our lives that we think are not impactful, but the reality is we are always on a spectrum of drawing closer to something or pulling further away from something. And the times that we can honor where we are in the present moment are the times that we will integrate what we need and throw away what we don't, instead of being reminded over and over that we are people who've lived traumatic stories, right? We know we're traumatized. We know we have trauma. That's not the question. The question is, are we going to live from that seat of trauma and response to it all of our days? Or are we going to sit next to it and say, you're safe here. When you're ready to unpack, you can. And if you're not ready for a long time, if ever, that's okay too. You actually still belong. All parts belong. And if that's true, then there is no reason to think that I wouldn't want all of those parts to remain with me and continue to inspire me into new things as I go.
Whew. That's so good, Mandy.
I'm glad. I'm a deeply traumatized and wounded heart that decided I also have more than a heart and all of it matters, right? Choosing myself, choosing that pathway was super scary. I lost most of my friends, most of my community. I lost so much confidence for a long time because I didn't have any answers. But getting to the other side and understanding kind of the biological reason for grief and trauma and all the things that are happening helped my education brain like decide, oh, that's interesting, that's information, that's true. But it also allowed me to be like, oh, there's actually no certainty, there are no guarantees or promises. And it is also true that I can have a faith practice that isn't reliant upon a certain outcome, a prayer and a quick dunk, and everything is made perfect. I can actually live a holistic, healthy, beautiful life outside of that framework of understanding. Let's go. And ironically, my background in anthropology was one of the things that came out of all these religious questions when I was young. And it was my favorite thing, being able to say, I can't wait to study this culture because it's in direct opposition to this culture. And they're both deeply valuable and incredibly necessary. And I believe both are right because their perspective, their history, their generational stories are so crucial. They're critical. They all belong. So I think expert, no, but deeply curious human, yeah.
There is a certain type of liberation when you can be honest with the weird that you're feeling, but also attuned to your body's needs when it comes to, especially when it comes to processing grief and loss. There is a lot of work ahead of folks who have decided to leave their faith formation or church altogether. Some of those folks land in communities called evangelical or deconstruction communities or even deconversion communities. My next guest is Meghan Crozier. And Meghan has started a deconstruction community, and she's learned a couple of things along the way in terms of what that community looks like, but also where we can find the potential and possibilities of life on the other side.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Meghan Crozier, and I live on the unceded lands of the Cowlitz, Klickitat, and Chinook tribes.
Otherwise known as?
Camas, Washington.
Give us the 10-second synopsis of your church upbringing. What do they call it in your story of your conversion story? No, your coming to Jesus story?
Testimony? You want my testimony?
Not the whole thing.
Wow. No, I did. I grew up in evangelicalism. I was in the Midwest and pretty close to Willow Creek. So we were modeled off of that community church
Chicago
model.
Illinois.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. But then I chose to go to a Christian school, and I was very much like a rule follower. I loved the rules. It was my comfort zone. And I was like, just give me the script and I'll follow it. And then I almost became a missionary after college. And sometimes I say taking a pledge to be a missionary it almost fucked with me as much as a purity pledge, just because I didn't follow through, and I became a bilingual teacher instead and walked this alternative path that I thought wasn't God's plan for me, and really was pretty fiercely evangelical, probably even until I was still in it in the pandemic, I would say. And then I deconstructed and left my marriage and changed careers, all kind of in the same 2-year span. So it was like I just put everything in a box and shook it all up. And now I'm me, but I'm a different version of me. Everybody kind of has the first big thread they pull, and I think it was queer affirmation. And, later I came out as bisexual. And so that was, somewhat of a personal journey for me. I think it was the political climate, but I would say it was what happened when I started asking questions. It was the responses you get when you start to say, hey, this doesn't add up or this doesn't seem right. And then it becomes, well, have you read this book? And it was like, I think you see the meme of like the power strip plugged into itself. And it's like, this is the Bible confirming what you were asking that the Bible would say, like and so it felt like this loop of like, if you don't understand this complicated thing in the Bible, here's a concordance from InterVarsity Press that's 3 times as large as the New Testament that you should refer to, that has the same beliefs that we do. And it just is this ever, ongoing, like, here are the authors that are quote unquote safe. And I just started to be like, no, I don't buy it.
What were some of the questions you were asking?
I would say I got involved in a small group that was very into prophecy and, all of that. And it was very connected to Bethel, because by that time I had moved to the Northwest and I wasn't, I'm like 6 hours from Redding, where Bethel is. I was like, this stuff doesn't add up. But then people would say things like, well, clearly this woman wasn't hearing from God because she's a lesbian, and that's clearly a sin. Things like that. And I'd be like, is it though? And I think I watched a sermon series, and a pastor said, if you're queer, you have 3 options. The first one is to be celibate for life. The second one is to force yourself into heterosexuality and just marry, the opposite gender. And then the third is, well, you could live as your full self, but you would not be living what God's plan is for you. And I just remember watching that and thinking, this feels like purity culture tripled and quadrupled down and just completely targeted at queer folks. And I felt like I could just feel the trauma like spilling out of that pulpit. And I was like, this is not okay. And so then I just started like digging and digging and digging. And I think, there's a lot of those topics that we never did really talk clearly about. I think a lot of people are super vague. And so once I'm like, oh, this is what the church actually believes. Same pastor said, complementarianism is just one of those things that we wish wasn't in the Bible, but it is. And I was like, wait a second. Yeah.
Done that. I wish. So your own inquisitiveness was really a catalyst to find your own liberation, but I doubt you would have called it that at the time. When you look back, do you kind of feel like, oh, parts of yourself were trying to be free?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's wild that you put it that way, just because I used to have dreams about being trapped like in a house or in, and having like I literally physically closed in, and whether that was my faith, whether that was my marriage, whether it was my career. I mean, I had a lot of things that I felt very trapped by. And so it was a journey to really, at times I would say, I would use the metaphor, like I felt like I was standing in front of a mountain and there was really no way, like even up and around or around it, I had to like take out a shovel and dig right through. Like it felt like there was that much work to really step by step, like disentangle things and figure out who I was and leave my marriage and have a new relationship and, all of those different steps and figure out like what it meant to be queer and also what it meant to be queer in like a straight passing relationship and all kinds of different pieces. So yeah, it was a journey. And it still is. It's ongoing. Like I'm not going to even ever say that I've arrived and am there.
I want to step back to what you just said, because something sort of clicked for me that I saw in you that wouldn't be my experience as a man. As you were saying how you felt trapped through these different intersections. And oftentimes when we talk about leaving the faith, we consider it this heady exercise, something that we just think about a lot. and then we read some books and then process out, and it's like this spiritual processing. But you were dreaming, like that is like, whoa. You were dreaming about ways you felt trapped, not merely in church community, but trapped in different ways. And that's, to me, that's indicative of the manner to which faith formation doesn't merely trap in a religious sense, but holistically across the different aspects that make us who we are, including your relationships, how you see the world, your work, and so forth.
Well, I will just say 1,000%, because it was so steeped in everything that I did. I was a public school teacher, but there were times where I would, pray in my car on the way to work for my students. I led a teacher Bible study in the summer for, teachers that were also people of faith. It wasn't something where I was like I've heard of teachers that pray with their students at the public school. I never was overtly, trying to witness, but it was also the way that I engaged with people. If they weren't Christians, that was a category I put them in. And I looked for opportunities to find ways to talk about my faith. And I would say even one of my biggest hobbies is running. And that was very spiritual for me at that time. I would feel like, oh, God will give me the strength to get through. I had worship songs that were about running, and my music was very steeped in that worship culture. And I think there was a lot of reclaiming that I had to do on the other side of things. I started a record collection because I was like, I want to reclaim the role that music has in my life. And I remember distinctly, I was training for a half marathon, and I remember getting out it was actually 2 half marathons I was going to do back to back on a weekend. And I went out to train, and I did 9 miles on a Saturday and 8 miles on a Sunday. And I just sat in my car and I just bawled, because I was like, I finally feel like my body is mine again. I feel like I did this work. I put in the work to train, and I got out there and I knocked out those miles, and I wasn't praying through it. I wasn't listening to worship music through it. It was all me. And I just and even my relationships, I talked to my therapist, and I'm like, this is the first relationship I have had that I haven't given to God in prayer, and
the running relationship.
So I'm no, my relationship with my current partner, because I'm I've always kind of waited to hear, I've broken up with people before in high school, my high school sweetheart, because I felt like God wanted me to break up with it. It's such a different way of thinking, to be like, oh, I can listen to myself and trust myself and make decisions for myself and know that I can have good values, and I'm not this inherently bad person that I have thought that I was for so many years,
Where did you find the courage to escape?
That's a great question. I got connected online right away. I was in Clubhouse rooms. I was asking questions. I was, I started writing. I wrote a memoir before I deconstructed it, that I was deconstructing that, because I think that faced me with kind of what my life had looked like and all of those things, like purity culture and that missionary pledge. And so I think it was little by little, I think being part of community, seeing that I wasn't the only one dealing with that stuff. I remember wanting to leave teaching and being told, not just by my partner, but by family members and other people in my life, this is who you are. You love this. Why would you ever change that? And not really feel. I had a couple people in my life that supported that, and I ended up. I took a leave of absence without having a plan, and I ended up getting a job at a community college. They were building a teacher education program, and I got hired to help build that program and be a professor. And I felt like I crawled out of that hole on my own. I dug through and I just figured it out. And people afterwards were supportive, but I was like, where were you when I needed you and I needed that help? And now I do something else. I work in educational publishing, and I've built a career there, and I'm working my way up there too. And I just feel like I had to just find it, because I wasn't getting it from the people closest to me at the time. And now I connected with people, found that community, and then just found ways to trust myself again, I guess.
When you say trust yourself, do you remember times, and maybe this is part of your practice, but I know for evangelicals, it's definitely not, practices of listening to your body. And when your body is screaming to be free, that you are attuned enough to not only listen, but then be proactive to extricate yourself from whatever is seeking to make you less whole. Were there moments where you're
Yeah,
like, yeah, that my body's screaming here?
it's interesting that you ask that way, because previously when I was evangelical, I wasn't very like
Yeah.
I
Who
wasn't very
is?
in tune to
Yeah.
that. And yeah, exactly. But then my therapist is amazing. I do EMDR therapy with her, and she's she's a somatic practitioner. And so she's always asking me, where do you feel this, whatever anxiety, whatever I am in your body? And at first it was driving me wild. Like I was like, why do you keep asking me that? And now I have, because she has helped me develop that habit of saying that. I do feel like I'll get anxiety in like my chest where I know that I always get it because of a certain reason. And I'm like, oh, I need to listen to what's happening in my body now. And I can take steps to help regulate, and I can do the things that I know now are going to be caring for myself. But before I never did that. And so now I think that practice is really valuable because I can really track my emotions and my mental health that way.
Let's talk about the grief, the loss, because this is across intersections for you, but maybe we'll tease out the faith side. When folks start to process out of their faith, they tend to either don't do it because you know you're going to lose all of your community and you don't want, it's frightening to be alone. But on the other side is your liberation. How did you navigate the eventual loss of all those people? I'm assuming maybe those people are still in your life, but chances are you have moved into like a totally different place, world, community.
Yeah, it has been a huge shift. I remember I asked someone for support once, and they wrote back and they were like, I was like fiercely progressive Christian at that time. I feel like I more identify as agnostic now. But I remember I was dealing with someone close to me had a significant loss. And I reached out to a few people that I had been close with and was like, could you pray for this situation?
Mm.
And the person wrote back and said, I would be happy to. And also, did I see that you support baby murder now?
Yeah,
And
that's just
I was like, whoa,
that's
like
you can't say
I
that.
yeah, and so people start to fit into categories, and I think the problem and the loss
Mm.
with that is that you start to just close down and feel this fear of uh, when I'm in person with people, I don't know how they feel. I don't know where they're at with things. I don't know what they've seen that I've posted, and I've lost relationships by making assumptions about
Mm.
where they're at too,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do that.
and so, yeah, and I've had, again, back to therapy, I've had to do therapy to get over worrying about what people think or really caring about, like, because I think like a lot of my rule following was a people pleasing mentality. And so now I'm like, okay, I'm going to do what's true to me and the people around me and the community that I fiercely want to stand with and for. And if that's going to, if someone has opinions about that, I'm going to do it anyway. But I think that there is a lot of grief in the way that relationships have changed. And I look at how some evangelicals in my life have responded to that. And I'm like, so you're pissed because I love people too much. Okay, I get it. Like, that's the grief. It's like, can't you
Mm.
see? Can't you understand that this isn't about trying to be divisive? This is about wanting to just love people fiercely, and you can't see that, and that is so messed up. Like that, like how can you not? How where's the disconnect here? Because that's what I was raised to do, is to love people, and
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
do it too much now. Okay, I'm not going to apologize for that. Like I've had people get mad because I'll say, hey, that phrasing or the way you said that is, maybe you might want to know to be careful because that is pretty ableist the way, and that just comes across and maybe you didn't intend that, and people are like, that's not what I meant. That's not, and I'm like, okay, so I have to pick and choose when I'm trying to advocate and who I'm doing that with and how I do that. But yet, like, I'm not going to wait for a person that is in a community that is marginalized to have to stick up for themselves all the time. That when I can have those conversations privately with people, so it's just, it is, I feel like people in my life might think, some of those people might think, damn, Meghan, you're kind of exhausting. Like, can we just have a conversation and you not be thinking about that? Close all the browser tabs and just chill. And I'm like, well, no, that's not how my brain works anymore.
You've named that you go to therapy, EMDR, trauma therapy. These are things to help us through loss and grief. How much of building and finding the deconstruction community pretty quickly, because like if you were processing around pandemic times, then that's around the time I found you, and you were meandering and bringing people together on this. How much was that a key?
I think it was crucial. I think it was very.
Did you do it on purpose?
No, not at all. I really stumbled into it because I told you I had written a memoir and I knew that authors had to have a platform, and so that's when I started like a blog and a social media. But I was starting to shift then, and I mean. One of my first blog posts was about prophecy and hearing God's. So it's like you can see the progression, and then I'm like, wait, hold on, and I'm kind of slowly deconstructing, and people are seeing the threads there. And so as that's happening, community is starting to be built because it's like I'll start to have conversations with people. And one of the ways that Cortland and I started hosting Thereafter together was because I was listening to his first season of Thereafter, and we really connected through that. Or I would read a friend's book, and maybe this happened with you, and reach out and be like, oh, I loved what you said here. Or I have questions about this. And so I think just that's how I'm wired. I love connecting with people, but I also love that dialogue small talk can be so exhausting for me. And I'm pretty extroverted, but like after a day of small talk, I'm like, okay, just give me I want to know the real stuff. Like I want to dig in. And I do that with coworkers. I do that everywhere. And so I think it just came naturally. And then pulling people together, like it just seemed to be, oh, let's have a regular time. Yeah. To just like meet and get together. And it came natural. But I also it was weird because if anybody were you ever in Clubhouse, the app? Did you ever jump in there with us?
No, I was going to be like, what's Clubhouse? But I was too embarrassed to say that.
No, it's really niche, but it was before Twitter Spaces. That app became popular, and it was right when we were all quarantined. And so a lot of people were in there having conversations, and a friend reached out and was like, I want to have a regular Clubhouse room on Thursday nights, and we would change the topic each Thursday night. And I helped host that. And because we were having these live conversations, we got to know each other. And then we had a Discord together, and then we would all interact on Twitter together. And everyone was holding space people were all across the board. I think we called it progressive and post-Christians chat. And so people that did not have any faith anymore were joining us, but then people that still held that onto that progressive Christianity. And it was just this really beautiful space. And everyone kind of helped moderate. We'd have people jump in that would, say something, and we'd be like, maybe not that. But it was less, hey, you got it wrong and we're going to be done with you. And more just like, hey, let's help each other understand where I remember asking, we did a room on polyamory, and I forget the question exactly, but a good friend of mine now, Brian G. Murphy, was in there. And I think it was me that asked, like, how do you respond when people ask about, like, what about your children? And he's like, that's a terrible question. Like, why would, like, that makes an assumption that polyamory is bad for children. And he was like, it's so amazing for children because you have multiple adults that are caring for you in your life. And so, like, why can't you reframe that question to something like, how does your relationship structure benefit the children in your lives? So I learned so much about even questions can be oppressive and, have hold assumptions and cause harm. And I'm all about harm reduction. And so if I did do that, like I would work to make repair, where I think a lot of people on social media and interacting worry so much about image. Like for me, it wasn't about image. It was about caring for people and connecting. And so I was like, okay, what's going to cause the least amount of harm, or be, in the vein of harm reduction. And then how do we make repair when we do cause harm? Because we will ultimately, and we can't promise safe spaces. We can, and the people who have the least amount of power are the people that have to have the most voice to call people out, and how do we create spaces where that is welcome and not, shut down? And so it became, and we still do a deconstruction coffee hour every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. Pacific time, and, all the other time zones, but it's still a very rich conversation. We have regular people that jump in every Tuesday and share what's going on in their lives. And it's a really life-giving space. It's kind of like a small group, I'll be honest. But I mean, why not, right?
There's a lot of micro communities like that are just very specific to some type of iteration off of something. And it's kind of proof that you can find your people somewhere and have something that is good. I'm wondering, okay, so you've named, I'm just fishing here for intersections of things that helped you process the grief and loss of leaving so many leaving a lot of aspects of an old life. Trauma therapy, finding community, regular community space of like-minded folks. Were there any other components that helped you or are helping you along the way?
Yeah, I will say I'm going to give a shout out to, I think we're mutual friends with Mandy Capehart, who does.
You're going to be on an episode with Mandy Capehart.
I love this. I love that so much. So, she and I and Ryan Mulkowski is somebody else. Ryan was a grief chaplain, and Mandy is a grief coach, and we would do clubhouse rooms, and I didn't have that grief expertise, but I would help facilitate. And then it was like a grief room where it was almost like grief support. And so specifically learning about grief and seeing it in action, seeing that support in action helped me so much understand how to process my own grief, because I learned what it looked like to let people grieve and to give people space to fall apart. And I realized that that's something that we lack, I think, in society. I think we often, if you say, "How are you doing?" and somebody just completely starts sobbing, you kind of are like the Homer Simpson gif where you're like backing into the bushes, like, oh, maybe I should not have engaged, And I think there's so much power in, no, really, I actually do care how you're doing. And let's go out to coffee or come over. And if you fall apart, you fall apart, and I'm with you. I learned so much about that, because we did have people crying, we did have people sharing, and I was grieving the loss of the classroom that I had taught. It's a whole long. I did an episode with Mandy on her podcast about leaving teaching and kind of what that journey was like. But the loss of like not having understood my queer identity at a younger age, and like just kind of all of those things. And so I think it took me understanding grief through that support to really kind of see, oh, these emotions that I have are related to grief, and that is unpredictable, and that can hit in waves like any other kind of grief. Because I think it just like trauma, I think people don't understand trauma the way that I wish everyone did. And I think grief is the same, where everyone thinks like, oh, grief happens when someone dies and that's it, and grief is so much bigger than that. And grief happens with so many other different types of losses. So understanding that helped me work through that and even give space to myself to heal.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. Let's switch gears. In the time we have left, one of the criticisms of deconstruction or folks in the ex-evangelical movement is that it's just replicating all of the harms that were mainstays or are mainstays in evangelicalism proper. As someone who has meandered and led in this nebulous space, because it's so organic and grassrootsy, yet at the same time, it's producing a lot of weirdness. And I'll say weirdness.
Yep.
And because there is no central voice, but there's definitely influencers. And so in a space where there's like no academics really, there's a handful of pastors, maybe, certainly no denominations, but there's definitely influencers. Things go off the rails pretty quick. So I wonder if you can, just through your own experience, because all you have is your own story in this, and neither of us are authorities on it. But I'll take anybody on anything on this deconstruction. What are some, I don't say things to look out for, but what are some of the cautions for folks who are now entering the deconstruction space to be alert of?
I love that you brought this up because it's something that I've had a lot of conversations off mic about and some on the podcast too, on thereafter. But I do think, I think of it as kind of like at the end of the Hunger Games, which it's been out long enough. I feel like we don't necessarily need a spoiler alert, but it's like, if they're trying to build just a new version of the same bad thing, then if you see people trying to be like a deconstruction pastor or build a deconstruction church, I think that is a red flag, or make a career out of the deconstruction space. I remember Janice Legata said one time that she doesn't want to have her income rely on traumatized people having to continue to come to her. It is. And it's so true because we're trying to make things better. We're not trying to create a space where we have to rely on people continuing to be traumatized. And so it's something that I've always done, as I've always had my own job and my own thing that I've done, but then, tried to do this on the side. And I haven't profited from that. In fact, I've put my own money into building events in spaces, and editing podcasts and stuff like that. But so not to say, and I'm not even saying that because there are folks that do make money on Patreon and things like that, that I think, I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but I just have to, I look at, what is the message that they're saying? I think there's a lot of cishet white guys in this space that are platforming themselves on things like queer affirmation, or things that they just should step aside and let queer folks say, or are we going to have someone, teach a course on decolonization when they're not somebody that has the lived experience to have, it's like, who are people learning from? Are they elevating those voices, or are they just centering themselves in those conversations? And so that's something that I've always tried to kind of navigate and figure out. And as I learn things, I share them, but I try to also just refer people to, this is the source of that information. This is where, this is kind of the voice that you can listen to kind of help you with that part of deconstruction. And there's certain people that just right off the bat, I'll just say, just because someone has 130,000 followers on Instagram doesn't mean that they're an expert in what they're talking about. And so I do think people tend to lend credibility to large Instagram accounts or people with large followings. And I think we need to stop that. I think and if you look at that, the balance towards white men that have those followings versus people of color or versus queer folks like that, it's not because those white men are smarter. I'm telling you.
Thank you very much to my dear friends, Mandy Capehart and Meghan Crozier, for sharing your expertise and your story. To you, dear listener, I tried to ask Mandy, and I tried to ask Meghan some questions about teasing out the tools that they used, the revelations that they had, and their own processing of grief and loss, leaving their religion, their churches, their traditions. Hopefully you found a piece of yourself in their stories. And I encourage you to find additional resources. We are coming close to the end of our journey in this serial season called Farewell Evangelicalism. Where are we going next? There are 3 episodes in front of us. I wanted to paint a picture, or at least start to, of what the possibilities of hope look like. We're actually going to have an entire episode devoted to hope. I asked most of my guests to name the possibilities of life-giving community. What does that even look like outside of the church? It could be in church, but outside of church community. What does life look like? And most of them shared their insights. But before that, we're going to shift into an episode on trans identity. Now, why would we do trans identity now and not as one of the malformed pillars around heteronormativity, around gender constraints earlier? And the reason why is because not only can we name a malformed pillar, but we also want to listen to voices on the margins and who have been pushed to the margins in our society and also in our faith for glimpses and pieces of what liberation looks like. That's coming up next, episode 10 on trans identity and liberation.
I call, but you never answer. I cry aloud, do you even hear me? I reach out as if you might catch me. There's nothing, I'm grasping at